Hello, Lost Mountain students, and welcome to Unit 2. I am super excited to begin this unit because this is going to be our first history unit. So if you're tired of looking at maps and transportation systems and geography and all of this stuff, now we get into my favorite part of the class, which is the history. And in Unit 2, what we're going to be focused on is the founding of Georgia. That will come probably in the next class. In today's lesson, what we're going to be focused on are the groups who were in Georgia before the British arrived. Now remember, the British started 13 colonies on the east coast of North America, and Georgia was the last of those 13 colonies. So there were people here before the British showed up, and they weren't even the first Europeans to show up. So in today's lesson, if you look at the topic for today, so for part 1, you will see that it says Native Americans in European exploration. So we're going to talk about the Native Americans who were here before the Europeans ever showed up. You know, they were here for thousands of years before anybody from Europe ever showed up. And then we're going to talk about the first European explorers to go to Georgia. This slide right here is titled Native Americans and European Exploration. Now, before we start talking about the Native Americans, we need to make sure you know some of the basic facts about colonization or the European explorers. And if you think back to elementary school, one of the very first things you learn in elementary school is usually this, that Columbus from Italy, but he sailed for Spain, discovered America in 1492. Now, one of the things that you learn is that Columbus, he sails across the Atlantic and he is looking for a trade route to India because he wants to be able to get spices and other goods, silk, things like that, and have an easier way to get to India. And he actually ends up landing in the Caribbean. And he doesn't know that, but when he lands in the Caribbean, he thinks he's in India, and he starts calling the people there Indians. Well, if Columbus discovered America in 1492, how could there have already been people here? Well, of course, Columbus discovered America for the other European countries like Spain and Britain and France, but there were already people here to begin with, right? So how did those people get here, and who were they? Well, today we call those people the Native Americans. You know, Columbus called them the Indians because he thought that, he was in India. Well, the thing is that we have a pretty good idea about how those early Native Americans got to North America. What we believe is that thousands of years ago, in between Alaska and Russia, there is this little body of water called the Bering Strait. And what we believe is that Bering Strait froze, and the very first people to go to North America were nomads who had crossed over from Russia into North America, Alaska and Canada, and then they sort of spread down through North America and eventually South America, and they became the Native Americans. They settled, they created towns and cities, and some were more advanced than others over time, and those were the people that Columbus found when he landed in North America. When it comes to the story of Georgia, and this first sort of Europeans to explore Georgia, that was also somebody who was sailing for Spain. It was a guy named Hernando De Soto, and I actually have a picture of him right here. And Hernando De Soto was what was called a conquistador, which is just another word for explorer. And basically, he traveled to Georgia after the Spanish had already sort of explored through South America and Mexico and the sort of southwest United States. Well, eventually they had created a colony, the actual first European colony in North America over here in St. Augustine down in Florida. And so De Soto decided that he was going to go to North America. He lands in Florida and he starts to explore the southeastern United States. And while he's doing that, he actually traveled through Georgia, South Carolina, he was in Tennessee, Alabama. He makes it all the way over here to the Mississippi River. And he gets the credit for being the first one to explore Georgia. Now, De Soto, like all of the Spanish explorers, his main goal was to find gold. he never found any. And unfortunately for De Soto, he actually died on his journey. And his journey is kind of considered a failure because he never discovered gold, right? And, well, along the way, Hernando De Soto and his men, as they were looking for gold, actually start to interact with some of the Native American tribes that they're coming across. And the tribe that they were sort of most interacting with in Georgia was this group called the Mississippians. And so the Mississippians were the Native Americans who were in Georgia when the first Europeans started to explore or come over here. And De Soto and his men actually kept journals of what the Mississippians were like. So we actually know a lot about the Mississippians, okay? So we're going to say the journals of De Soto and his men provide a clear picture of what the Mississippians were like. You do need to know that, okay? Now, unfortunately, De Soto did not treat the Mississippians very well. And on top of like capturing them and, holding them hostage and telling them how, trying to make them tell him where the gold was at because he was convinced they had it hidden away, he also unknowingly spread a lot of diseases to the Mississippians. So things like the flu and smallpox and measles killed thousands and thousands of the Mississippians and actually contributed to the sort of collapse of the Mississippian society. So you do need to know about the fact that they killed many by spreading their diseases. So this slide is about the Mississippians. And what you need to know about the Mississippians is first, they were here when the first Europeans showed up in Georgia, and we know about them because of the journals that De Soto took. We just talked about that. But you also need to know about their culture. And the first thing you need to know about them is that the Mississippians were considered a chiefdom society. And what this means is that in their society, they had different levels of power, okay? And the three levels of power in the chiefdom were the chief, which, chiefdom, chief, and basically he was the ruler of their town, and he passed down his sort of title through families, okay? Then the next level of power in the chiefdom society was a group called the elites, who were kind of like the upper class, and these guys were sort of seen as like the religious leaders and people like that. They got to also live in better homes like the chief. They didn't have to do manual labor. These were kind of like the higher class people in society. And the last level of power in this chiefdom society was a group called the commoners, who were considered the lower class, and these would have been the people doing the manual labor. These were the farmers and the soldiers. The next thing you need to know about the Mississippians is that they were not nomadic. Now, if you don't know what nomadic means, nomads were people who moved around from place to place following food. They did not stay in one place and grow food. The Mississippians did stay in one place. They built pretty advanced towns and cities, and in order to do that, you have to be able to support the people in those towns and cities by having a source of food. And so what you need to know is that in the Mississippian towns, they developed a system of agriculture that allowed them to support these towns. And so what they decided to do is they grew things like corn, beans, and squash. They also did a lot of hunting for things like deer and other things like that. And when they would grow their crops, they grew it in a pretty smart way. What they would do is they would have all of their crops in one field. And let's just say that this is corn, right? Now I can't draw, and I'm trying to draw on a computer, so it's even worse. And then let's say down here, you are growing things like beans or squash or whatever. Well, what the Mississippians did is they would grow all of these crops in the same spot, but they would let the corn grow above the smaller crops and shield it from the sun, which made sure that their food survived. It was more successful. Okay. And that's an important thing. You do need to know that about them, that they were not nomadic. They developed a system of agriculture, and you need to know what food they ate and how they grew their food. Okay. The next thing you need to know about the Mississippians is that they were considered mound builders. And if you look at this picture over here, there are all of these huge mounds. Now, these mounds were all used for different things. So if you look right here, you'll see that there are mounds where there's houses up here. And if there is a house up here, that's where like a chief would live, or one of the elites could be living in this area right here. The other reason that they built mounds is that they would build smaller mounds like this one right here that has a flat top on it. And this mound would have been used to bury people. So they would bury their dead in these mounds, and they would bury them with like, blankets or possessions that they had in their life. And what this shows is that the Mississippians believed in an afterlife, because usually when, like if you learned about the ancient Egyptians, they built their pyramids, and they would build, they would bury the dead kings with, gold or whatever for this, because they would need it in the afterlife. The Mississippians kind of had a similar belief system. So you also want to know that they built these mounds to bury the dead, and they built them for the chiefs and elites to live upon. Okay, so I would definitely want to know that. And that they had a belief in an afterlife. Okay, now you do need to know what happens to the Mississippians. Unfortunately, the Mississippians are sort of killed off because they were enslaved, and also sort of infected with a lot of different diseases from the Spanish, which could include the flu, smallpox, and measles. And when the Mississippians sort of died off, they were replaced by two other tribes that you've heard about before. Through the sort of destruction of the Mississippian culture, we see the rise of two groups. One is the Creek, and the other is the Cherokee. And you would want to write that down, okay? All right. One of the things that you do need to know about when it comes to the Spanish and their sort of interactions with the Native Americans was that the Spanish did not treat the Native Americans very well. Now, some of it they did on accident, spreading diseases and killing, hundreds of thousands of them. But other things they did on purpose. And one of those things that they did on purpose was this thing right here called the mission system. And you need to know what the mission system was, okay? So one thing that you probably want to know is that the word mission in this context just means a church, okay? And when it comes to the Spanish, one of their primary goals when they were going to North America was to spread their religion. And so the Spanish were Catholic. And so when they would take over these, other groups, they would try to convert them to be Catholic. And that was the same thing they did when they would encounter groups like the Mississippians. And so one of the things that the Spanish would do often is they would create these things called missions or churches right outside of the towns of the Mississippians. And then they would try to get the Mississippians to go to these churches so that they could teach them the Spanish language and the Spanish beliefs and way of life. But they had to figure out a way to get the Mississippians to volunteer to go to the missions. And so here's what they would do, okay? The Spanish priests, the people in the church, would go to the chief of the Mississippians, and they would create deals with them. And basically what they would do is they would say, hey, the king of Spain has all of this cool stuff that you don't have, whether it's guns or, they didn't know how to work with steel, so he could give them weapons that they wouldn't normally have. And they would say, in return, chief, we'll give you all of this stuff, but you have to send your people to our church and let us teach them about our religion and our lifestyle and things like that. So in a way, the chief was volunteering his people, but the actual people were not volunteering to go. Eventually, over time, the Spanish would say, hey, now it's not good enough. If you want to keep getting these goods, it's not good enough that you just, send your people to our church. Now you need to go down to St. Augustine, Florida. And while your people are in St. Augustine, they need to work for us for a few months out of the year, helping us, grow crops and things like that, which, if you're thinking about it, the chief is taking goods from the Spanish, and then he's sending his people to go and forcing them to go and work in another area. Sounds a lot like slavery, right? Which is what it was. Well, eventually this goes on for, years and years, and eventually the Mississippians start to wonder if it's worth the benefit for them, because what they're realizing is the Mississippian population numbers are starting to go way, way down, because as the people are going there, they're catching diseases, they're dying, they're, working there and coming back and spreading these diseases to the people who were in the Mississippian towns. And eventually the chief starts to lose his sort of support of the mission system. So you do want to know that. So the native population started to dwindle, which means just go down due to disease. But one of the interesting things that happens as well is that the British start colonizing North America in the 1600s. The very first British colony was Jamestown in 1607. And what they realize is, hey, the British and the Spanish, they don't like each other. And the British are like, what can we do to make life harder for the Spanish? Because, we want them to give up that land in Florida. And it takes a while before we get Florida. But one of the things that they do is they say, hey, we can make life harder for them because we can give the Mississippians weapons so that they could fight against the Spanish. And so that's what they did. So you want to know that the British also helped contribute to the end of the mission system by providing the natives with weapons, okay, to fight against the Spanish. And you do need to know that the mission system combined with diseases basically leads to the end of the Mississippian culture, okay? Now, if we were going to look at this map right here, one of the things that you do need to know is that most of the missions or, churches were on the coast of Georgia, and, they were in the barrier islands, okay? So that's a test question that you would want to know, that the missions were along the barrier islands most of the time. And this is the final slide for this presentation today. And I know what you're thinking. This guy, he just keeps talking and talking and talking. I'm sorry. There's a lot of information in this unit, okay, guys? But the final slide right here is talking about European exploration. And you need to know that when it comes to European exploration in North America, there are three main countries that you need to know about, okay? The first of these countries, and we've been talking about them this whole time, is Spain. And what you need to know about them, if you looked at this map, you would see it says that they colonized Florida, they colonized sort of the southwestern United States, down into Mexico, all the way down into South America, right? So that is where the Spanish were located. You also need to know what their reasons were for colonization. And the Spanish are really easy to understand. Their three main reasons for exploration were God, spreading the religion, gold, money, and glory, which is just another way of saying sort of fame and power, right? Well, the Spanish, we know, were not the only people to come to North America. The next group that actually came were the British, or England, and they settled along the east coast right here of North America. And they founded the original 13 colonies, right? And you guys know about the 13 colonies. You learned about this a little bit in elementary school. And of course, Georgia down here would have been the 13th and final colony. The first colony was Jamestown, Virginia. And so that was in 1607. Georgia was not founded until 1732. Okay, so that kind of gives you an idea of how much younger Georgia was, about 130 years, than some of these older colonies up here, right? Now, what were the reasons for the British going to North America? Well, you probably learned in elementary school that there was a group of people called the Puritans who went to America because of religious freedoms, and they rode over here on a boat called the Mayflower, and that's all true. But those people were up here in Massachusetts, okay? And they founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Those were not the first group, and that was not the only reason that people were going to North America. In reality, the most common reason that the king, the British king, would allow his people to leave and go and found colonies that he had to support was because of this idea right here, which is called mercantilism. Basically, mercantilism is this idea that a large country like England, or a powerful country like England, should take over colonies because those colonies are going to have resources that they may not have back in England. And then what they will do is they will take those resources and sell them to make money. And the idea is that you want to sell as many resources as you can. And hopefully you have so many colonies that you don't have to ever buy things from other countries. And the idea is that you, by doing this, will start hoarding gold and money, and you will become the richest of the other, sort of powerful countries. Okay. So when people say that, the American colonies were founded because of, looking for gold or riches or opportunity, this is what they're talking about. They're talking about this idea of mercantilism. Okay. Now, the last country that we have to talk about, and which was the last of the sort of countries to go to North America, would have been the French, okay? And the French started up here in Canada, and they eventually started to spread down into sort of what is today the United States, and they kind of followed the Mississippi River, and all of this stuff was called New France, okay? And what you need to know about the French is that they came here for the fur trade. So the French were actually probably the most kind to the Native Americans. They didn't try to convert their religion or fight with them like the Spanish and the British did. After a while, they tried to trade with them. So they would trade things like guns and finished goods to the Native Americans in return for fur. And then they would take that fur back to England and sell it for a lot of money. And the number one thing that the French wanted was fur, so that they, it was beaver fur, so that they can make hats from it, because that was a very stylish thing at this time in history. And these people made lots of money out there hunting for fur. And then, of course, land. All three of these countries wanted money, right? Okay, so what you need to know is that these three countries were competing for land and resources. So you do want to know that that was sort of the primary motivation of these three countries.